So this afternoon, we're going to explore a bit about choosing that fierce compassion and expressing it as wise engagement. And to start us off, it's a great pleasure to introduce Kaira Jewel Lingo, beloved teacher, Spirit Rock, and other places. Kaira Jewel, if you don't know about her, she was an ordained nun for 15 years with Thich Nhat Hanh in his community, and she is focusing on the intersection between racial, climate, and social justice, and she is the author of a book that recently came out. We Were Made for These Times: 10 Lessons in Moving Through Change, Loss, and Disruption. So, Kaira Jewel, so glad to have you with us. All yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, James. It's been wonderful to be with all of you today. I've been really nourished by every presentation, every sharing so far. I'll share that my pronouns are she, her, and that I'm calling in from the lands of the Munsee, Lenape, and Merrick peoples of Long Island, New York. And yeah, I know we are all from many places on the planet, and I really honor each of you and the lands, the ancestors of the lands that you live on and are supported by and nourished by. So I'll offer some reflections and then offer a meditation, brief, and then we'll have a short time for some interaction, questions, sharings. So when we look at ecological and racial justice, they are two aspects of the same reality. They're not really able to be separated. You can't really do justice to one without the other. And I want to begin by calling in an ancestor. That's an important ancestor for me, and I think for all of us. This is Howard Thurman. He lived from 1899 to 1981. He was an American author and philosopher, theologian, educator, civil rights leader, and many also knew him as a mystic, a deeply grounded person in his spiritual practice, and that had a lot to do with his connection to the earth. So he really was a kind of foundational spiritual leader for the civil rights movement and the whole tradition of nonviolent social change and resistance. He went to visit Gandhi in India and was a key mentor to many of the leaders of the civil rights movement, including Martin Luther King Jr. There's a free 50-minute documentary about his life on YouTube called Back Against the Wall. It's a wonderful resource about his life. So he was born in Daytona Beach, Florida. He was raised by his grandmother, Nancy, who had been enslaved as a young woman. And he had a very deep transmission of spiritual power from her, but also from his community and through his connection to nature. He talked about it as a windbreak against existence, this refuge he found in nature. So I just want to read you two quotes from him about his relationship to the natural world. Nightfall was a presence. The nights in Florida as I grew up seemed to have certain dominant characteristics. They were not dark, they were black. When there was no moon, the stars hung like lanterns. So close, I felt that one could reach up and pluck them from the heavens. The night had its own language. At such times, I could hear the night think and feel the night feel. This comforted me. I felt embraced, enveloped, held secure. In some fantastic way, the night belongs to me. He goes on. Eventually, I discovered that the oak tree and I had a unique relationship. I could sit my back against its trunk and feel the same peace that would come to me in my bed at night. I could reach down in the quiet places of my spirit, take out my bruises and my joys, unfold them and talk about them. I could talk aloud to the oak tree and know that I was understood. It too was part of my reality, like the woods, the night, and the pounding surf, my earliest companions, giving me space. So, just a few days ago, I had the opportunity to visit his childhood home in Daytona, Florida, Daytona Beach. My partner and I, we pulled up to the house and we were attracted to this particular oak tree that was out in the front of the yard. And I'll invite Jesse to pull up a picture of this oak tree. We had found this oak tree, and then my partner, so we were sitting at the oak tree, and then he pulled up a picture of, it's called Howard's oak tree in this documentation about his life. So this is the oak tree some time ago, I imagine. And we looked at the picture, and there were a few oak trees in the yard, and we wondered which one was this tree. And so we got up and we backed away from the tree we had naturally been drawn to. And I'll invite Jesse to show the second picture of it. This is a picture I took. It's the same tree, many, many years later. And so we were delighted that we had found his tree, and we sat there in stillness and invited his presence to be with us, and connected to the tree, this tree that had listened to all of his stories, to his bruises and his joys. And so, leaning my back up against the tree, I offered gratitude for it and how it had sustained such an important mentor and a Black lover of the world, lover of life, an activist, a healer. And that this tree was now continuing to sustain me and to sustain others. So I asked the tree for support, for its protection, and also made a commitment to do my best to show up and be of support to it, to the natural world. Thank you for showing these images. I hope you can touch the support of our ancestor, Howard Thurman. So I share this story because we've had some wonderful encouragements today about the importance of love, of coming from love. And this is what my teacher Thich Nhat Hanh also said, that it's only when we fall in love with the earth that we can survive. That the way that we can really nourish and fuel a response that's wise, that's sane, that's compassionate, is by connecting to that inherent instinctual love that we each know towards the natural world. This is what Thich Nhat Hanh says, that we can all experience a feeling of deep admiration and love when we see the great harmony, elegance, and beauty of the earth. When we truly see and understand the earth, love is born in our hearts. We feel connected. That's the meaning of love, to be at one. Only when we've truly fallen back in love with the earth will our actions spring from reverence and the insight of our interconnectedness. And so he goes on to say, the only way we can do this is to come together and work together. This tradition of individualism, competition, has brought about destruction, alienation, and we have to be able to see each other as children of the same Mother Earth. So he says, only then, when we really see each other clearly, will we have the strength, awakening, and love we need to bring us together. Cherishing our precious earth, falling in love with the earth, is not an obligation. It is a matter of personal and collective happiness and survival. This cherishing, right? We've seen beautiful presentations today that it's not about the numbers and beating people over the head with facts. We have to, we ourselves touch this source of energy which comes from our sense of connectedness, our being in touch with the awesomeness of the earth. And I also would say, falling in love with the earth, we are each the earth. We are each manifestations of the earth. So if falling in love with the earth is what it will help us survive, then we also need to learn how to fall in love with each other. And so spending time to learn about people that are different from us, to read their books, their poetry, to listen to their stories, to take time to learn and appreciate their cultures, their histories, as well as our own. There's a lot that we don't know about our own histories often, and the intersections of peoples, including our own ancestors. So we have come to this place of great danger because we have not been aware of interbeing, that this is because that is. This is a key Buddhist teaching. This is not because this that is not, right? Everything is interconnected. So when we discriminate between human and other beings, when we think humans are different and better than other beings, then we think we can live at others' expense. And that is very expensive. So it's similar with patriarchy, with white supremacy. One gender, one race decides it will live at the expense of another group or other groups. And this always leads to a reduction in the quality of life for everyone. Kriti Kanko is listed in the document of resources for today. And she's an Indian biologist and climate scientist. And she writes about how white supremacy is the mother of the climate crisis. And so she says that this mentality of domination is really the source that's been feeding and nurturing and defending ecological destruction through its harm that it's brought to people of the global majority, or BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So she says this: another way to say this is that the unregulated greed of multinational oil and gas corporations, often touted as a reason for the climate emergency, is rooted in and is a result of centuries of minimization, ridicule, and wars brought to BIPOC cultures. The current economic system has been delivered by white supremacy. So this mindset of domination, she says, that has enslaved, that has pushed people off their lands and destroyed indigenous cultures. It's necessary for destroying forests, for causing habitat loss of animals that leads to their extinction, polluting ecosystems. So this fundamental ignorance of taking one group to be human and other groups as less than human, it is at the root of the destruction of our planet. It's at the root of seeing other species as less than our own and therefore dispensable. It's at the root of seeing the natural world, or so-called inanimate things, as less than living beings. And there's a beautiful text in the Buddhist sutras, the Diamond Sutra, a Mahayana Buddhist text that says there are 4 notions that we have to let go of. It's the diamond that cuts through illusion. So these are the illusions that we have to cut through. The 4 notions are self, the idea that we have a separate self, a lifespan, that we have a birth and a death, the notion of a human as separate from other beings, and then even the notion of a living being. That is also a notion that has to be let go of. So you could call this one of the earliest ecological texts, this Diamond Sutra. But if we practice to release these 4 notions, that is key, a huge step towards ending patriarchy, racism, and our addiction to fossil fuels that really makes us act like abusive children to Mother Earth. So So this is playing out now in these conversations, in these, deep self-reflection in the environmental movement. So we're going to hear about regeneration very soon. But one thing that I appreciate that this movement is talking about is that to reverse climate crisis, we have to pay attention to current human needs, right? Because so much of the discourse is what's going to happen in the future. Although we know that if we're not experiencing climate change right now, that's a privilege, right? Many, many people who don't have the privilege of white skin, of living in a wealthy country, don't have that privilege to say climate change is coming in the future. But much of the discourse is, it's this existential threat. But what I appreciate about regeneration, this regenerative approach, is that we have to pay attention to current human needs. And Paul Hawken says, if humanity isn't paying attention to the climate crisis, it's because we aren't paying attention to humanity. Right? That if the climate movement isn't directed toward the needs of the vulnerable, the impoverished, the disenfranchised, and those suffering right now, who will only suffer more, then we aren't serious about it. So this isn't a top-down solution of policy. This has to come from those who are experiencing it the most. And traditional environmental work hasn't brought in racial awareness or the ways environmental suffering and degradation are inextricably interconnected with other forms of injustice. So you can't have a single issue approach. You can't say in the environmental movement, well, we're not going to focus on race, because that's ignoring a whole reality of people who are being directly impacted now and who have been for generations by environmental racism, right? And so Kriti Kanko says later in that same article, a wise, compassionate, and wholesome global climate movement will attune itself with the concerns of BIPOC frontline communities and look at white supremacy within the movement. One can't deal with the climate emergency without facing racism head on. So we can see this, right? Someone already mentioned The Intersectional Environmentalist, this book by Leah Thomas. In this book, she writes, intersectional focused climate organizations receive less than 5% of the $2.4 billion granted annually for the environment. Within that, an even smaller amount goes to Black people, Indigenous people, immigrants, and other people of color. Women of color receive just 0.6 of total philanthropic benefits in the US across all issue areas, despite being the backbone of most communities. This is why we can't save the planet without the voices of the most marginalized. So I've been really enjoying this book, All We Can Save. I don't know if it's come up yet today. Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. It's all women writers. And beautiful, inspiring reflections and solutions, examples that are happening. There's a woman, Fabiana Rodriguez, who writes about harnessing cultural power. And she talks about growing up in East Oakland and being exposed to pollution because of a highway that ran through neighborhoods where people of color lived that allowed trucks, whereas the highway that went through white neighborhoods did not allow trucks, right? And she also speaks to the ways in which what's coming out of the climate movement, especially traditionally, she says most of the stories and cultural content that exist to inform and organize people are pain-oriented, outdated, and hella white. She says they don't reveal the racial and economic drivers behind the climate crisis. They don't reflect the reasons why my community was exposed to pollution while white communities just a few miles away had better air quality. In fact, most often they either leave my people out of the story entirely or center white men as activist heroes and rely on doom and gloom narratives. So it's not that people of color don't care. That's not the reason why this face of the environmental movement is so white. In fact, polling has shown that people of color are more alarmed or concerned than their white counterparts. That includes 69% of Latinx Americans, which is the most of any racial group. So white supremacy is why you don't see that, why you don't know that, right? Why that's not, you don't see those faces when this issue comes up. So what's so important when we look at what's happening is to harness the power of our imaginations, to also really not just focus on what we don't want, on what we're afraid is going to happen, but also to really give life to what is possible, what we do want. And just to mention this movie, A Message from the Future, it focuses on AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Congresswoman from New York. It's a 7-minute film on what a future would look like in the US if we were living in balance with the natural world, what an outcome of the Green New Deal might look like in the future. So just an example of how we can use our cultural power to create other kinds of messages that embody what we do want, what it means to have a climate movement that's powered by people of color, by their stories, by their experiences. And so in this article, Fabiana Rodriguez says, the stories we tell will determine whether our society declines and self-destructs or whether we can heal and thrive. So this is really about our imaginations, what kind of stories we decide to tell. There's so many movies on Amazon, on Netflix, big box office hits that focus on apocalypse, right? On the end of the earth, on a meteor hitting the earth or on the earth. So many films about that, right? I learned that it's easier for people to imagine the end of our planet than the end of capitalism. You know, like billionaires are talking about using outer space to, to produce things on earth, to produce things so that, why aren't we looking at what we have right here, right? That's how we use our imagination, and we can really invite in the cultural power of BIPOC cultures to help reframe that narrative, reframe those stories. So there's so much to share about the disparate ways that people of color, BIPOC communities are impacted um, by the climate crisis. The realities of environmental racism, um, really shortening the lives and destroying the health of BIPOC people and communities very disparately compared to white communities. And that really needs to be something that we learn and we study. A good article from Greenpeace, I won't go into the details, but I just encourage us to read it, is Fossil Fuel Racism. I think that's a very accurate term, fossil fuel racism, how phasing out oil, gas, and coal can protect communities. So that's on their website. But just, Black African American people have 1.54 times the exposure to particulate matter compared to the overall population. So that's in terms of where people live, kind of things they're exposed to. So we want to really be putting faces to these facts, right? Knowing that it's really Black and brown people, Indigenous people, that are bearing the brunt of these decisions, of where to put, oil refineries, and where to put things that really are disastrous to people's health. And so phasing out these fossil fuels is a key way to protect communities of color. It's really not optional. So let me invite us to transition into a reflective time. And I'm going to invite you to reflect on some questions. And you might want to write, but you might want to reflect silently. So maybe just first connecting with the body and noticing what your physical response has been to this sharing about racial and ecological justice. Taking some breaths, just noticing what's here for you. Maybe some of this is not new to you. Maybe this is something you're very familiar with. whether it's new or not new, how does it sit in you to contemplate? Taking in this reality of the day-to-day danger, basically, that communities of color, poor communities are placed in. Stop giving that space in your body, in your mind. Noticing as you connect with whatever is there, if there's some response that arises, what might you be called towards in response to this? This connection between climate and racial justice, climate and racial suffering. How might you want to engage with this? This intersectional environmentalism. How might you aspire to be present to this reality? What urges arise in you, in your body? And so just invite us to hold this as a question, as an invitation. And if there are things that you might wish to share in the chat, reflections or ways that you're moved to respond or to be in connection with this intersection, then I invite you to share in the chat. And so, well, invite you to share at any point in the chat, but we'll also open the space now for your questions, your reflections. I think we have about 5 minutes for some discussion.
Hi, yes. Yeah, my name is Babu. I'm studying in Singapore, but currently in the US visiting some family. Yeah, thank you for this retreat, and thank you, Sister Jewel, for that sharing. My question is, I notice now that a lot of events or groups that have some type of interaction will have like BIPOC specific space. And I have mixed feelings about that. And I'm not sure if it's best to, go to that space, which is great because there's other BIPOC people. But then I feel like part of the solution should be integrating the BIPOC voices with the normal discussion. So I'm wondering if you have any advice or how you would kind of approach, like, do you agree with this type of space or this type of setup, or is it not actually part of a sustainable solution? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Babu. I just want to note the usage of the word normal, like a BIPOC space and then a normal space. So that's just something to investigate, that like what's white and white dominant is associated with what's normal. Just to kind of see that, right? That we need to question that. It's very deep in each of us also. And, I think the difficulty with kind of rushing to bring the BIPOC voices into the white dominant structure is that white supremacy is so deep in each of us as BIPOC folks, as white folks, that sometimes it's hard for BIPOC folks to actually get in touch with what is true in them and what we need to say in a space that isn't protected, right? In a space where whether, it's often very unconscious and unintentional, but it's the patterns in society of domination repeat themselves. So, men tend to speak more, white people tend to speak more often, interrupt people of color, interrupt women, right? So there are things that like just happen unconsciously. And so having a space where folks can connect with what it is that's really true for them, for us, is really important, and it doesn't mean that those streams can't come together and don't need to come together, but it's also like under what terms, right? Is it, okay, now you've had your time as BIPOC, now come back and, we'll keep going in the same way we've always been going. That doesn't change, right? So one thing I've been a part of in groups is, how do you center BIPOC voices in a space that's mixed, right? How do you give more time to listen, to understand voices that have been traditionally silenced? And so I think it needs to be, held with discernment and with tenderness, because we're dealing with generations of harm and wounding, and that doesn't get unpacked and healed overnight. And it's so subtle, the ways both BIPOC and white folks play into this, often unintentionally, often unconsciously, that having some space separately can really allow for a clear seeing of that and possibility of healing of that. And then the way we negotiate coming back into community together changes, so that it's not just a repeat. Thanks for the question, Babu. Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. I mostly agree, for whatever that's worth, with pretty much everything you're saying in some ways. I just wonder about this part of, like, when you mentioned the Diamond Sutra. Those are some pretty big things to let go of. I was looking at the list. I'm not really sure I agree it's the 4 things, but I haven't thought it through to be to see what I really think. But one of them is identity. And do you find it hard to talk about these or like, I wonder how you think about, because it seems like there's an increased orientation around certain aspects of identity, which would seem to be going in the other direction. I mean, it's so freaking complicated. I bow down to the task at hand. You know what I mean? Like, it's just so hard. But I found myself somehow feeling out of sync with something about the way that a lot of us are coming at this, some of these questions that are arising right now, and we want to talk about it. I think it's really difficult for me, and I'm wondering just how you think of that, because if you say patriarchy, that's a kind of identity, et cetera, right? All sorts of things. If you say Black, if you say whatever, I just wonder how you think about that.
Yes. No, I think, to me, what's really helpful in the Buddhist teaching is that there are 2 truths, right? There is the historical dimension of reality, where we have Black, brown, Indigenous, white, men, women, non-binary people, all of our identities. And there's the ultimate dimension, which is where the reality of letting go of those notions of self, lifespan, human, and living being can be touched, where what it really means to realize our full potential in this life, where we're not bound by those concepts. Those are just notions, right? But in the historical dimension, they matter, right? That's why so many people of color live in neighborhoods where they get asthma, because the air is so polluted. Yes, the ultimate dimension exists right alongside the historical dimension, right? Like I existed before I was conceived. I existed in my parents and my ancestors and all the things that nourished them, right? So my birth date isn't really my birth date in the ultimate dimension. But I need a birth date on my birth certificate to move through the world, to do what I do. That's the reality of the historical dimension. So the historical dimension has a real impact. It's not the only dimension, but the actual way to access the ultimate dimension, this extremely powerful place of freedom, is through the historical dimension. And I think one of the things that happens is when we start talking about white supremacy and patriarchy, there's a shrinking from that. It's painful, especially if we have privilege in those areas. We would rather not, get in those waters. But if we can really get into that, touch it. What does it mean to have that privilege? What does it mean to not have that privilege? We can, through the historical dimension, not by going around it to stay comfortable, but through the historical dimension, we can touch the ultimate dimension, which is, I can't be without you. You can't be without me. If I don't take care of you, I can't take care of me. If you don't take care of me, you can't take care of you. And so that sense of really holding this truth of our interbeing, but it comes by being willing to see the reality of the historical, of the suffering that's happening every day. That's how we transcend, how we heal that, not by ignoring it, not by trying to say, well, those things are some fabrication, right?
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Brian.
And thank you, Kaira Jewel. And it's an aspect of climate work that we need to keep on keeping in the spotlight. That this is the inequity and the injustice and the othering is as much a core problem of learning to wake up. So thank you so much for bringing light to it and keeping it in our minds and hearts. So thank you very much.